CGM are very powerful diabetes management tools. And what's particularly powerful about CGM are the trend arrows that give you information about which direction and how quickly glucose levels are rising or falling. So the first step in using trend arrows to manage diabetes is knowing what they mean. There are two very popular CGM available at this time, and those are the Dexcom G5 and G6, and then the Abbott Libre. So let's talk specifically about the trend arrows for each of these devices. First, Dexcom G5 and G6. The first is a steady trend arrow. And with this arrow pointing straight ahead, we can see that glucose is steady and not changing any more than 1 milligram per deciliter each minute. So if your glucose level is 100 right now, in 30 minutes, it will probably be about 100 still. Look at this next picture. This shows two arrows pointing straight up. This means that glucose levels are rising rapidly. And if your glucose level is 100 milligrams per deciliter right now, in just 30 minutes, it could be as high as 190 milligrams per deciliter. Next, let's look at the single arrow. This arrow indicates that glucose is still rising quickly, but not as fast as the double arrows. And this means that it's rising about 2 to 3 milligrams per deciliter a minute. And by way of example, if you're 100 right now or your child, in 30 minutes, glucose levels can be predicted to be about 160. This next arrow is slightly slanted upwards. This means that glucose levels are rising more slowly, about 1 to 2 per minute. And that means that if glucose levels are 100 now, if you don't eat or take any insulin, in about 30 minutes, they will be about 130 milligrams per deciliter. Now let's look at the downward trends. The downward trends, this angled arrow down, shows that glucose is falling 1 to 2 milligrams per deciliter each minute, which means that if you're 100 milligrams per deciliter now, you'll be about 70 in 30 minutes. One arrow down, falling 2 to 3 per minute, which means if you're 100 now, you'll be 40 milligrams per deciliter. That might be a time to intervene. And finally, if glucose is falling rapidly and you or your child are 100 right now, in just 30 minutes, the predicted value is 10. So this would be a time to really intervene. Let's take a look at the arrows on the Abbott Libre system because they are different and they mean different things than the Dexcom arrows. So if you're going back and forth between the two devices, you need to make sure you or your child or the school nurse or whoever is taking care of a person with type 1 diabetes knows what the arrows mean. So let's have a look at those. In the Abbott system, with this straight ahead arrow, glucose is steady and not changing, meaning just like with Dexcom, if you're 100 now, we would predict that you would be 100 in 30 minutes. Look at this single arrow up. This means glucose levels are rising quickly, or 2 to 3 milligrams per deciliter a minute. If glucose levels are 100 now, in 30 minutes, we predict they will be about 160. With this angled arrow, glucose is rising 1 to 2 per minute. So if you start at 100 now, in 30 minutes, you'll be at 130. And similarly, but in the other direction, if we have an angled arrow down, and that means glucose is falling 1 to 2 milligrams per deciliter each minute. And if you are 100 right now, then in 30 minutes, we would predict you might be as low as 70. And then finally, a straight down arrow on this system means that glucose is falling quickly, or 2 to 3 milligrams per deciliter per minute. And that means if glucose levels are at 100 now, they are predicted to be as low as 40 in 30 minutes. Knowing what the arrows mean on the CGM is essential. We don't just want to know a number, where you are or where your child is, but we want to know where that glucose level is going so we can intervene appropriately. There's more information back on the website about what to do with these trend arrows. Thanks so much for listening.